Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Today we're looking at the Sendy Peacock headphones, but before we get into the review, I just want to say a huge thanks to the one-off PayPal donors. The people I'm specifically talking about are those that haven't signed up for Patreon, but occasionally send me a contribution through PayPal, just as a way of saying thank you for the content on the channel. The reason I wanted to raise this here is that when I get those emails from PayPal telling me I've received such a donation, there's no easy way for me to reply and say thank you. So I'm saying it here, for those who've sent one-off donations via PayPal, I thank you very much. You'll know who you are. I deeply appreciate the support, and it always goes towards making more and better content for you. So thank you very much. I do appreciate you, and I apologize that there's no way for me to easily reply. With that out of the way, let's talk about a really interesting headphone in the Sendy Peacock. The Sendy Peacocks are about a $1,500 plain and magnetic headphone. From Sendy/Sivga, they're basically the same company, with Sendy being the higher level brand, a bit like Lexus, and Sivga being the cheaper brand, a bit like Toyota. That doesn't mean that Sivga headphones are bad, but they do seem to separate their products based on the price points into those two brands. I've seen very mixed reviews for the Peacocks here on YouTube. I checked out a bunch of different reviews when I was waiting for these to arrive, just purely out of curiosity. I don't actually normally do that, but what that led to was me having no expectations and really not sure what I was going to get when I opened up the Peacocks and took a listen. At about $1,500, the Peacocks are priced right up there with the HiFiMan Aryas. And so suddenly they're in very stiff competition and had a lot to live up to from a competition point of view. But I really didn't know what to expect based on the reputation. Straight out of the box, I think they're a really interesting looking headphone. No doubt the black and gold design is going to leave some people a bit cold. I personally quite like it. It's a bit blingy, but I don't mind it, even though I'm not normally into bling. But all in all, they look and feel like a really nicely made headphone. You've got genuine wooden cups. You've then got this lovely black and gold pattern. Some beautiful leather finishing on the headband, which has also got some nice little lumpy paddy bits. There's a suspension band over the top for the adjustment. And then finally we've got a pair of high-rose connectors facing forwards to prevent the cable from coming down and hitting you in the shoulders. So there's lots of good things about the Peacock straight out of the box. They're quite a heavy headphone, but they're in no way uncomfortable. They've got a good sized opening for your ears to go in and nice clear labelling so they're easy to put on, although obviously the high-rose connectors here pretty much give it away which way you put them on anyway. But everything about them is pretty solid. Nothing wowed me about them out of the box, but certainly I didn't feel like anything was lacking from both a looks but also a design quality and a fit and feel point of view. While we're talking design, it is worth noting the interesting shaped pads. So these have got a thicker section down the bottom of the pad and a thinner section up the top. And that can lead to some interesting measurement challenges because it doesn't seal so well on a dead flat plate for a measurement rig, but on the head it seems to work just fine. So when we do look at measurements later, you might notice a bit of bass roll off. Whether or not that's entirely accurate, I'm not quite sure. Certainly I don't feel like I'm hearing extreme bass extension, but they're not lacking either, as I'll talk about when I get to sound quality. Before I get there though, just to wrap up the design segment here, everything about these feels quality and sturdy and solid. You've got metal parts where there should be metal parts, you've got leather and nice padding wherever it's contacting the skin, and then you've got these beautiful genuine wooden cups as I mentioned before. So the look and the feel is all up to standard for the price of the headphone, and in fact in many ways they feel better built than something like the Aryas that I mentioned before. HiFiMan have never been renowned for their build quality, I've had no problems with them, but they certainly don't impress with with their build quality and the feel of materials in the way that something like the Peacocks do. The final thing I want to mention about the design of these is that they're using a planar magnetic driver. There's all sorts of talk on the Sendy website, as with every brand and every headphone, about the fantastic and unique technologies that are built into the Peacock. In my opinion, none of that really matters. Every company's got these fantastic next best thing type designs, but the reality always comes down to the fact that there's multiple ways to achieve the same outcome. This is just one of them, and therefore for me, it's all about how they sound, which I'll get to soon. What I do want to mention about the driver design though, is that these are a 50 ohm, 103 decibel sensitivity headphone. And what that means is that they only need 6 milliwatts to get to 110 decibels. Now, if you're not familiar with the channel, the reason I use 110 decibels as kind of my goalpost for power measurements and power expectations is that safe listening levels should sit somewhere in the 80 to 85 decibel range. What that means is that if you can get to 110 decibels, you've got buckets and buckets of headroom available. Headroom being the space between the volume you're listening at and the absolute maximum of the amplifier. And so if you've got plenty of headroom, you're not pushing the amplifier to extremes and you're going to be hearing the headphone at its best. I like to talk about power requirements in all of my reviews because there is still an ongoing conversation about planar magnetic headphones needing more power, particularly more current, but 6 milliwatts is a tiny amount of power that any portable device, let alone desktop device, can handle with no problems at all. And to be clear, that 6 milliwatts includes the amount of current required. So the fact that you can get to 110 decibels, which is way more than you should need, with just 6 milliwatts means you're not going to have any problems driving these headphones. If they don't sound how you like from a source, it's because the source has a tonal character that doesn't match up well with the headphones. And so with that covered off, let's talk briefly about accessories before we get into the sound quality. The Peacocks come with this lovely leather, or at least fake leather, I'm not sure if it's genuine, but this leather hard case. It's not a headphone that I expect people are going to be carrying around a lot with them, but it is a nice touch to get that kind of quality case if you do want to travel with your headphones. Inside that case, which also the headphones are packaged in when you receive it, also along with the headphones, you're getting a nice woven 4-core cable that's terminated in a 4.4mm balanced connector, and of course a pair of, when I can get to them, high-res connectors at the end. Now these have got fairly bold red and blue markers on the end for left and right. Some are going to like that, some aren't, but ultimately it's a nicely made cable. It feels good quality, it does the job very effectively. It's also got a nice wooden wire split in the middle, which is a nice touch as well, given you've got the genuine wood on the headphone cups. For those who aren't running balanced, or maybe not running 4.4mm balanced, you also get a pair of adapters in the form of a 4.4mm female to 4-pin XLR and a 4.4mm female to 6.3mm jack. So you've got everything you need covered except maybe a 3.5mm connection, but I don't see these headphones being something you're going to use with a lot of portable devices because they're quite big and they are open. So all in all, I think the accessories provided with the Peacocks are excellent for the money. It's way ahead of something like the Arya, where you're only getting a basic cable that's pretty stiff and tends to hold its shape. It's not a bad cable, it's way better than the old HiFiMan cables used to be, but I do think something like the Peacock is better accessorized. And so initial impressions of the Peacock, taking them out of the box, putting them on, feeling their comfort, using the accessories, is that you're getting really good value for money. The question then of course comes down to, how do they sound? Are they worth the money from a sound quality point of view? And I have to say that they're a really interesting sounding headphone. I don't agree with those that have flat out panned these and said they're dreadful. I'm not sure if maybe there were some early product variances, maybe even some faults with these, who knows, but I'm not hearing what some other reviewers heard. There's no doubt to me that the Peacock has its own sound, there's a few little quirks with its sound, but ultimately it all adds up to me to an enjoyable listening experience. The thing that most stood out to me as I spent lots and lots of time with the Peacocks across a whole range of different amps is that they've got a great sense of clarity and insight into the music. They don't push details at you, but everything's really available to hear textures and details across the board. Those textures and details tend to be focused mostly on the mids and the lower treble, but it's never overly done. It doesn't push any of those upper mids or lower treble in your face, and that makes for an enjoyable listen. It's worth noting that the bass isn't particularly present or particularly deep in terms of extension, but I also wouldn't say it's lacking in bass. These aren't a headphone for lovers of deep, rumbling bass, say electronic music for instance. These aren't necessarily going to be the best choice for that, but they're not in any way anemic or lightweight either. If you've watched a few reviews on the channel, you'll know that I like a warmer, richer, and often bassier headphone. I wouldn't consider myself a bass head, but I like to have a bit of soul and richness and thump from the music. And whilst these didn't exactly hit the sweet spot for me, they also didn't leave me feeling like they were vastly lacking in that area. They're not, say, like an HG800S, where I always felt like I wanted more bass, but they're also not like something like, say, a Mezzo Elite, where they've got that lovely sense of bass and body and presence. And so ultimately for me, I'd describe their tonality as being fairly neutral, fairly natural. I would like a tiny bit more bass, particularly down low where they do start to roll off in my opinion, but the overall tonality is quite well balanced because the treble drops down a little bit from where the mid-range sits and therefore for me produces a really enjoyable overall sound. I'll provide a comparison to the HiFiMan Arya soon, so you'll get a better sense there if you're familiar with the Aryas as to exactly what I mean about these. Before we get there though, I want to talk about soundstage presentation because that's where the quirks start to happen for these. The soundstage from the Peacock is a really unusual inside the head soundstage. And I say it's unusual because there are other headphones that keep the soundstage fairly inside the head, but most of them start to feel congested because of that small amount of space. With the Peacocks though, I never felt like it was congested. They do a good job at separating the sounds, and so even though everything is maybe only just a tiny bit wider than the ears and all kept sort of level with the forehead and back, everything sounds pretty well separated. And in some ways that inside the head presentation is part of what gives them that sense of insight and clarity over the music. That's particularly true for things like vocals and mid-range instrumentals, where the Peacocks really help you to focus in on that vocal performance or that instrumental performance that's focused right dead center in your forehead. It's a different experience. It's not going to be a good experience for those wanting a huge expansive soundstage, but I've found myself thoroughly enjoying the Peacocks. To me, these are an example of an intimate sounding headphone that's actually really positive in the sense that it's not overly rich or lush or thick, and yet it still brings everything in to this wonderful intimate presentation. And so after spending a bunch of time getting to know the Peacocks, listening to them across all sorts of genres, as I said before, different gear as well, I ended up at a point where I thought I was really enjoying them. And then the final test for me was to see how they stacked up against the HiFiMan Arya. And sometimes in the past I've found with a headphone like this, I've enjoyed them in isolation, and then I put them up against something else that I know to be excellent, and I suddenly realise there's a massive gulf between them. And I must admit, based on some of the reputation that I heard about these coming into the review, I did kind of expect that the Aryas were just going to run away with it and make me feel like a fool for kind of liking the Peacocks. I did my initial listening of the two, that being the Peacock and the Arya. This is the Arya Stealth Magnet version. I did my initial listening via the Cord Mojo 2, and I have to say I felt like the two headphones were very, very close together in performance when listening from the Mojo 2. Before I finalised any thoughts though, I came back into my office here and plugged into the TT2. And this is a wonderful, wonderful reminder of something that's worth being aware of. And that is that when you get to headphones at the level of things like the Peacock, the HiFiMan Arya, anything in that sort of $1,200, $1,300 plus range, you really need to start thinking about the devices you're pairing it with before you make up your mind. And the reason I say that is that the differences that I heard between these two from the Mojo 2 were nowhere near as clear as the differences I heard when I went to the TT2. And that's because when you're getting to headphones at this kind of level and above, particularly if you're going higher, the device or devices that you're feeding them with play a huge part in what you hear. Products at this level will scale extremely well with better gear. And whilst the Mojo 2 is an excellent, excellent device, we should never expect a $700 or $800 device to compare with something worth $10,000, being the TT2 and the M-Scaler. And they're very rough numbers off the top of my head. I might have the wrong pricing there, but the point is we're talking 10 times the value. And so what I heard when I moved to the TT2 was a much better sense of the difference between these two. Yes, there were clearly differences when I listened to both from the Mojo 2, but listening from the Mojo 2, I probably would have chosen the Peacocks out of this comparison. Moving to the TT2, it became a much trickier proposal as to which one I would prefer because both of them were really shining in completely different ways. And so let me explain now what I heard. And the track I'm going to use to do that is Confines by Black Pumas. Starting off from the Peacocks, and as I've already said, the soundstage stretches just maybe a tiny little bit wider than the ears, but it all stays pretty much inside the head. In the opening passage with the drum kit, the clarity that you hear from the Peacocks is really excellent. There's a great sense of naturalness to the way that drum kit's delivered. And then when the vocal comes in over the top, it's wonderfully focused and clear. Admittedly, the drums and the vocals are kind of on the same plane. There's not a lot of depth difference there, and that is a bit of a shame. But I also felt like they were separated enough that it wasn't a huge problem. The guitars are off to the left and the right in this track, and they're all really well defined and separated in the mix. And so everything I was hearing from the Peacocks was enjoyable, it was very clearly rendered, and a thoroughly engaging listen. Moving over to the Arias, and there was immediately a much greater sense of space in the presentation, and particularly an extra sense of depth that the Peacocks didn't have. Now, as someone who generally prefers soundstage, you might think that that was game over, but it actually wasn't, because there are still pros and cons with both headphones. On this track, the Arya still didn't throw a soundstage that went significantly outside the head, if at all, but there was a greater sense of overall space, largely because of that better sense of depth. Having said that, the Arya does have more treble in its presentation, and it left me actually preferring the tonality of the Peacocks. Whilst the Arya has the edge on bass extension, that bass extension is actually offset by additional treble, and so it ends up coming across sounding like the leaner headphone. And so the little bit of extra warmth and richness from the Peacocks, which are still very much a natural and relatively neutral sounding headphone, that little bit of richness that they have because of the slightly rolled off treble, for me makes them a more enjoyable and in some ways a more natural listen. And I love the Arias, so this is not a knock or an easy win for either headphone. What I'm hopefully doing is sharing that both have their pros and cons. Because of the Aria's brighter, more enhanced treble, it does come across as being a little bit more detailed, particularly micro details, so that sense of resolution is slightly greater from the Arias, but it's actually only because of the treble response, I believe. I didn't feel like anything was missing from the Peacocks, it was just that it was turned up a bit from the Arias. And so after all of this listening, what I found was that we've really got two very different headphones here. We've got the Peacock, which draws your attention into the mid-range, like I said before, vocals, instrumentals. It gives you a wonderful sense of insight into what I'd call the core of the music. On the other hand, the Arias spread everything out with so much more space that it's easier to kind of wander around the mix. There's lots of detail and texture, but sometimes that can be too much depending on your tastes, your preferences, your source chain, etc. And so for me, I've been left in a really interesting situation. I already own the Arias, and the Sendy Peacocks here are on loan, but one of the things I often think about is which one would I actually want if given the choice to purchase, and I honestly have no idea. If you were to put both these headphones in front of me and say choose one, assuming I didn't already own the Arya, I really and truly do not know which one I would choose. Ultimately, I would probably go, I think, for the Peacock because it's different. It's not like every other headphone out there. I've already got the Susvaras, I've already got the Ananda, and so in some ways I like the fact that the Peacocks are doing something a bit different. They're giving this lovely mid-range focus while still staying very textured and detailed and not at all thick and lush, but at the same time not going down the path of boosting the treble to create this sense of clarity and texture and detail that's a little bit artificial sometimes. So to wrap all this up, if you're in the market for a top tier, and we're talking not that sort of flagship $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 headphone, but what I would call a somewhat affordable top tier headphone, if you're in that sort of market, and maybe you've been scared off the Arya by the fact that it does have that bit of extra treble, and I know some people aren't a fan of that. If you're looking more for something that's a bit more mid-range focused, a bit more about vocals and a touch of richness without getting thick or overly lush, then I think the Peacocks could be a really good option. As I said before, they're not a particularly bassy headphone, but they're not wildly lacking in bass either. They're not ideal if you want deep extension and rumble from the sub bass, but having said that, if you apply a bit of bass boost from an EQ, they absolutely can deliver. So if you're looking for something different and you want to go outside the world of things like the HiFiMan Arias, then I do think the Peacocks are a great choice. I'd love to put them up next to something like the ZMF Auteur, which I also love, which is around the same price. But sadly, I don't own a pair of Auteurs, so we're going to have to wait for that one and see if somehow it happens when I get my hands on the Auteur Classic. So for now, I'm going to close all this off by saying, don't get swayed by some of those really negative reviews on the Peacock. They're not that bad at all. I don't know what was going on, if there were faulty units, whatever was happening. The pair I've got here are thoroughly enjoyable. They're a different take on the music, which still sounds good, and therefore is a great thing because it offers an extra flavour. So if you're in the market for a new headphone and you're roughly in that budget area, don't write the Peacocks off your list. Do think about them, consider what I've said here, and see if they might fit your tastes. So I want to say a huge thanks to Sendy and the local supplier for sending them out. Also, I want to say a huge thanks to Sendy for this headphone stand. I know a few of you have asked before about this one. This is the Sendy headphone stand. Check it out on their website if you want to know more about it. As always, I'll put some links down below where you can find out more about these headphones. There's no affiliates or kickbacks with this. It's just links to help you buy them if you're interested. And as always, if you found this review useful and helpful, I'd love it if you'd hit subscribe, ring the notification bell, and hit the like button. It helps me know that you want to see more videos like this so I can keep producing what you want to see. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.